Do not think. Now, what does that mean? Don't think this, right? I mean, just simple as reading. Can't misunderstand. Do not think I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy but fulfill. Okay, stop. Some people think that Jesus came to fulfill the Old Testament law, and that means he came to abolish or do away with it. Now, if Jesus saying, I came to fulfill the Old Testament law means I came to abolish it, listen to how silly that'll sound. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to do away with. Wouldn't that be the same thing? That would be a contradiction. So, what does fulfill mean? When Jesus came to John the Baptist to get baptized, and John, recognizing he was the Messiah, said, Lord, what's going on here? I need to be baptized by you. I'm paraphrasing. And Jesus said to John, suffer it to be so now, for thus it's appropriate to fulfill all righteousness. Now, does fulfill mean do away with? Does fulfill mean abolish? Would Jesus have said to John, you need to baptize me to abolish all righteousness and do away with all righteousness? No. Fulfill all righteousness. It means to fill full. It means to complete. So Jesus didn't come to do away with the law. He came to fill it up in his life, to make it complete. See, the Old Testament law still was not complete in that they didn't understand all the underlying principles. In the Sermon on the Mount that we're going to study this morning, Jesus takes the law and he unpacks it and he makes it complete so that they can comprehend it. Someone look up for me, or let me just see where the microphones are. Okay, we got one here. Someone look up for me, Psalm 119, verse 142. Who has that? Right hand right here. We'll get you a microphone. And I don't know where you might be that has Isaiah 40, verse 8. Is that a different side? You have that verse? Okay, so you'll be up next, but it'll be a minute, Melissa, okay? Now, here's a very important verse. Isaiah 51:7. Oh, Isaiah 42:21, sorry. Go with me to Isaiah 42, verse 21. The Lord is well pleased for his righteousness' sake. He will magnify the law and make it honorable. Now, this is a section that is talking about the Messiah. What would the Messiah do? Magnify. Is that like delete, the delete key on your keyboard? I've got another function on my keyboard where if I press the control button and I scroll, it makes anything on my screen get bigger. It's wonderful. Because as you get older, you use that more. Magnify. And so what does magnify mean? Make bigger or make smaller? Does it make something more blurry, obscure, or does it make it something more clear and sharp? So did Jesus come to do away with it or to make it more clear? That's what it means to fulfill it, to make it more crisp. He came to magnify the law and make it honorable. Why did he make it honorable? Because some of the man-made traditions that the religious leaders had put on the laws brought shame and reproach. The Sabbath law is good. And Jesus often had conflict with others because he'd heal somebody on the Sabbath. And he became angry with him. One day there was this man who had a withered hand in the church on the Sabbath. And Jesus asked them, he says, is it better to do good on the Sabbath or evil? And they wouldn't answer him. How many of you that has a sheep or a donkey that falls into a pit on the Sabbath, they will not pull it out? And they wouldn't answer him. And so Jesus was angered. He was grieved at the hardness of their hearts. And he told the man, stretch forth your hand, and he healed them. Because the idea that a donkey or a sheep was more important than a man, the pagans would laugh at the way some of the religious leaders kept the law. It was dishonored because of the traditions that eclipsed the commandments. So Jesus came to make it honorable so that others would say, oh, it's a beautiful law, it's a wonderful law, it's a fair law. All right, go with me now to Psalm 119. You're going to read that for us, Aaron, verse 142, I think.
Psalms 119, 142. Thy righteousness is an everlasting righteousness, and thy law is the truth.
Now, the first part of the Sermon on the Mount deals with something called the Beatitudes. As a matter of fact, if you look in your lesson, you'll see in the first page of your lesson, it says that the Sermon on the Mount's really divided up into 4 or 5 sections, if you can count the conclusion as a section. You got the Beatitudes, Matthew 5, 1 through 12. You got the section on light and salt in Matthew 5, 13 through 16. Then there's a long section where Jesus gives a deeper perspective on the law. And then you've got a long section on Christian behavior, and that's Matthew 6 through the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And he concludes then with the wise and foolish builder on whether or not you will listen to what he had said previously. If you have a red letter version of your Bible, you'll notice the longest uninterrupted red letter section is the Sermon on the Mount. It is a sermon that Jesus preaches. And it doesn't take that long for you to read through it, but it's pretty powerful. Look how often it's quoted. But the first part of that sermon we just told you is the Beatitudes. Do we see the 10 Commandments listed in the Beatitudes? Is the law of God reflected in there? Or is he doing away with it? Well, we just heard Aaron read, "Thy righteousness is an everlasting righteousness, thy law is truth." Is there a beatitude that talks about righteousness? Blessed are those that hunger and thirst after righteousness. They will be filled. Isaiah 51:7. Hearken unto me, you that know righteousness, the people in whose heart is my law. Is there a connection between righteousness and the law? Yeah, we just read that. And so the Beatitudes are connected with the law. Let me give you another example. What does the Beatitude say in Matthew 5:7? Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. All right? If you look then, for example, in Exodus 20, verse 6, in the 10 Commandments, showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. What commandment is that in? That's in the 10 Commandments, and more specifically, that's in the commandment about idolatry. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the sons unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me, but showing mercy. Everyone gets hung up on the 3rd and 4th generation. They don't read the rest of it. Showing mercy unto them that love me. See, do you know in the 10 Commandments it says, love me and keep my commandments? The key to the 10 Commandments is in the 10 Commandments. Love me and keep my commandments. It's right in there. Is there a beatitude that talks about purity? Matthew 5, verse 8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And is there a connection between purity and the law? 1 Peter 1:22, I know I'm going to the New Testament. Since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth, through the Spirit, in sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently with a pure heart. Obedience and purity. There's a connection there with the law. And then Jesus goes on to say in Luke 16, and this is under the section, actually everything I said thus far was an introduction. In Luke chapter 16, verse 17, under one jot or tittle, it's easier for heaven and earth to pass than for one tittle of the law to fail. Now, just to make this similar to our vernacular, when we write, you've got a little dash or the crossing of a T. That was the Jewish equivalent in their characters for a tittle. It was a little like an accent mark. And a jot was like what we would call the period that we use on a sentence. In Hebrew writing, they did have these little, the very smallest marks they would make in their writing. Jesus said it would be easier for heaven and earth to vaporize and pass away than for even a jot or a tittle to fail from the law of God. So is Jesus saying that I came to change or do away with the law? And yet, do you hear Christians teach that? Yes. Now, there are things in the law that Christ replaced in that they were symbols that pointed to Him. The laws about sacrificing lambs. Do we need to sacrifice lambs anymore? No? Well, we do. It's Jesus as our lamb. We accept Him as our sacrifice, right? And so it's really, those things still apply, but Jesus is the lamb. And you can look at the laws that they had about the feasts and circumcision, and Paul is very clear, those laws that came later, they were symbolic. Matter of fact, the ceremonial laws and the feast days, they all came after sin. entered the world. The Ten Commandments really existed from the very beginning. Was it wrong to commit murder back in the days of Adam and Eve? Did God look down on Cain killing his brother? Was adultery wrong before the Ten Commandments were written? Did God tell Joseph that, misbehaving with Potiphar's wife would be a sin? Isn't that what Joseph said? How can I do this thing and sin against God? So they knew that stealing was wrong before the Ten Commandments were written. They knew that lying was wrong. And you can find examples of this even long before the Ten Commandments were written. And so these are eternal principles. The ceremonial laws and some of these things relating to sacrifices that were shadows, yes, they were nailed to the cross. They're written on paper. They point to Jesus. But the principles that Jesus gives in the Sermon on the Mount, they're eternal principles. All right, read for us Isaiah 40, verse 8, please.
Isaiah 40, verse 8. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever.
The Ten Commandments are eternal principles. It is true that Jesus has summarized the Ten Commandments. Matter of fact, someone look up for me Matthew 7, verse 12. Who got that? Got a hand over here? Let's get you a microphone. Matthew 7, we'll get to you in just a minute. Matthew 7, verse 12. Jesus did summarize the Ten Commandments. If you were to summarize the Ten Commandments in one word, what would it be? Love. How many agree? And then if you are going to summarize the Ten Commandments, if you're going to divide that into two principles, what would it be? Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor. Well, that's the new commandment that Jesus gave that replaces the old. Have you heard that? We don't need to keep the Ten Commandments because Jesus gave us a new commandment. Because he said, a new commandment I give unto you. I mean, he said it. But then when he articulates the new commandment, when he states it, what is he doing? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. He's quoting Deuteronomy chapter 6. And he says, love your neighbor as yourself. He's quoting Leviticus 19:18. So Jesus, when he says a new commandment, and then he quotes the Old Testament, he quotes Moses more specifically. How new was it to the Jews? It wasn't new. He said it's a new principle for you to understand that all of the law is summarized in love, right? This would probably be a good time to read that next verse if we're ready. Yeah, Matthew 7:12.
Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets.
All of the law and the prophets are not done away with, Jesus said. They are summarized in do unto others as you would have them do unto you. There's a law that says if you find your neighbor's donkey wandering out on its own, even if he's your enemy, the Bible says take it back to him. There's someone you can't stand. You just got this difficult neighbor, and he just makes you miserable. And you see his donkey's wandered off, you can say, oh, great, I'm glad it's happening to him. No, God says that's not the right attitude. Go get his donkey, bring it back to him. Overcome evil with good. Well, that's the teaching of Jesus. That's in the law of Moses. Whatever you would have others do to you, do also to them. It summarizes love for God and love for your fellow man. Now, one reason we know the law is not done away with is if you look, for instance, in Revelation 11:19. Revelation 11:19. It says, then the temple of God was open in heaven, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple. Now, when is this happening prophetically? This is happening, in the sequence of Revelation. It's not in the early days of the church history. It's in the final events. The temple of God was open in heaven. Certainly, it's after the time of Christ. How did the ark get to be in heaven?